Hey folks! Tonight we're diving into the weird, often ridiculous last moments of folks who were supposed to be all regal and majestic royalty. Kings, queens, emperors, their lives full of pomp, power, and gold-embroidered robes. Their deaths, well, let's just say some of these nobles really wanted to be forgotten. Before you get comfy, take a sec to like the video and subscribe only if you actually like what I'm doing here. No pressure. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fun to know who's joining the weird royal party worldwide. Now, lights off, fan on for that soothing background hum. And let's gently slide into tonight's tale, King Adolf Frederick of Sweden, who died from dessert. When it comes to how kings bite the dust, you've got all sorts dying in battle, betrayed, or lying on silk sheets surrounded by noble sobbing. But Adolf Frederick, he went out courtesy of his sweet tooth. It was a cold February night in 1771, and like many of us, after a rough day of doing absolutely nothing productive, Adolf decided to treat himself. But his treat was basically a culinary death wish. The royal dinner that night was ambitious lobster, caviar, pickled cabbage, smoked herring, and champagne. Not just a sip, but multiple glasses, enough to make even the royal wig dizzy, but none of that killed him. Nope. What did 14 servings of semla, if you're not Scandinavian? Semla is a sweet wheat bun with cardamom and almond paste, topped with whipped cream, soaked in warm milk. Delicious, but seriously heavy. One is plenty. Adolf here went for 14. That wasn't dessert. That was a sugar-fueled assassination. The courtiers must have been horrified. By the 10th to 13th bun, someone probably whispered, "Your Majesty, maybe a little walk to digest." But the king just waved them off, spoon in hand, cream still on his lip, determined to die in style, and die he did, that night. He complained of stomach pain, got worse, collapsed, and the official cause of death, digestive failure, or in plain English, he ate himself to death. His legacy, a pretty peaceful reign, a few administrative reforms, and the title of the king who literally ate himself to death. Gotta admit, that's a unique way to go. And yeah, it's way better than some other royal exits. He wasn't assassinated, didn't fall off a horse, didn't die from a plague or a cursed drink. He died from cake, honestly. That's got a certain regal flair. Next time you're about to grab that second slice, and hear a little voice in your head saying, why not just remember King Adolf Frederick and maybe reconsider, or, just put down the fork. Now, King George II, death on the throne. Royals usually imagine their final moments with some dignity bedside farewells. Weak Latin whispers, maybe a soft orchestra playing. But King George II of England, he died on the toilet. Yep, you read that right. It was the morning of October 25th, 1760. George II, in his 70s, woke up feeling a bit off, but he stuck to his morning routine light chatting, a bit of royal grumbling, then, like every man, went to do his business, except he never came back. Minutes later, the servants barged in and found him slumped over his chamber pot. He'd ruptured his aorta, the biggest artery in the body, and died instantly. So technically, he died of natural causes, but the location absolutely unignorable. Picture this King of England, Elector of Hanover, defender of the faith, ending his days not on a bed or horseback, but half sitting, half lying there, pants down around his hips. Definitely not the kind of portrait you'd want above your fireplace. They found the man slumped over his chamber pot. He'd burst his aorta, the biggest artery in the body, and died instantly. So technically, it was natural causes, but the location totally ungraceful. Picture this: the King of England, Lord of Hanover, defender of the faith, ends his days not in a royal bed or on horseback, but half sitting, half lying down mid-business on the throne, pants around his waist. Definitely not the kind of portrait you want over your fireplace. To be fair, that chamber pot wasn't your average bucket. It was porcelain, probably trimmed in gold, and guarded by a professional retinue trained not to freak out. Still, it's the kind of death whispered about in footnotes, not sung in ballads. Doctors wrote their reports, all proper and formal. The public was told he died of heart disease, which was true, but the full story survived thanks to palace gossip and a few honest servants who couldn't keep quiet. And history hasn't forgotten, because despite all his achievements, wars, reforms, and an empire stretched far and wide, George II is mostly remembered as the only English king who died on the toilet, a legacy nobody asked for and no one else has managed to top. He ruled an empire but died like a regular guy. Then there's Sigurd the Mighty, who died from being bitten by a dead man. Royal deaths can be tragic, silly, or, well, this. Sigurd the Mighty's end is so bizarre, even Shakespeare wouldn't have dreamed it killed by a bite from someone already dead. Back to the 9th century, Sigurd Eysteinsson, aka Sigurd the Mighty, was Earl of Orkney, a Viking warlord, a fierce warrior, and basically the tough guy from Northern Europe. His whole life was raiding, conquering, and terrorizing the islands of northern England. One day, he took down a Scottish enemy leader named Ridic in a classic Viking mix of confidence and questionable hygiene. Sigurd tied the severed head of Ridic to his saddle as a trophy. Pretty standard Viking behavior, brutal, but considered a productive day's work. The problem: Ricta's head still had teeth. As Sigurd rode home victorious, the head bounced around, as severed heads do when tied to saddles. At some point during the bumpy ride, one of the dead guy's teeth scratched Sigurd's leg just a tiny nick. Nothing serious. But if you're living in the 9th century, no antibiotics, and zero infection control, that scratch got infected faster than you can say ouch. So the victorious Viking, who'd killed dozens of enemies, conquered lands, and crushed warlords, ended up dead from a scratch. Not just any scratch, a nasty, infected bite wound. Talk about cosmic irony mixed with a dark comedy twist. Imagine being remembered as a war hero who ultimately got taken out not by ambush or dagger, but by a mouth that's technically already 6 feet under. That wasn't even moving anymore. Historians aren't sure if Sigurd's men laughed, cried, or just quietly untied the head and walked away. Probably all three. Sigurd's story became legend not for his victories, but because he might be the only Viking in history to die from dental hygiene issues, Prince Sado, the guy who died in a rice chest. Some royal deaths make you giggle, others make you slowly put down your chopsticks. Meet Prince Sado of 18th century Joseon, Korea, a young man born into luxury, trained to rule, but ultimately remembered as the prince who died in a box. No metaphor here, literally died in a box. Sado had issues: mental instability, violent tantrums, erratic behavior, call it what you want. But the court described him as wildly unpredictable. He once ordered servants executed on a whim and was rumored to wander the palace at night, mumbling to himself with a sword. As you can guess, He wasn't popular. His dad, King Yongzhou, was a Confucian king, calm, composed, and obsessed with appearances. Executing his own son would cause political chaos and a spiritual scandal, but letting him live was way more dangerous. So the king came up with a creative solution. He locked Sato in a huge wooden chest, basically a giant rice bin. This was mid-July in Korea, which is about as pleasant as being sealed in a box. No ventilation, no water, and zero hope for a quick death. Sato lasted 8 agonizing days. No trial, no sword, just a slow, suffocating death, forever remembered as one of the most uncomfortable royal deaths on record. This kind of death makes exile or beheading look downright humane. Official records, edited for posterity, say Prince Sato died by divine judgment, which sounds poetic, but honestly, he was locked in a rice chest until he died. Ironically, his son, King Jongjo, later became one of Korea's most famous rulers. The family never publicly mentioned the rice chest incident, but historians sure haven't forgotten. This is a tale of palace politics, mental illness, and brutal cruelty wrapped in wood and sealed with silence. So next time you complain about a cramped, hot summer, think about Prince Sato and be thankful nobody solved family drama with furniture. King Martin of Aragon died laughing. If you've heard laughter is the best medicine, let me introduce you to the one and only historical figure who died from laughing too hard, King Martin of Aragon. It was 1410, near the end of his reign. Martin was battling digestive issues because what's royal drama without stomach problems? He spent the day in bed, not from injury, plagued by chronic gas and indigestion, the kind of royal stink that makes court officials give you a wide berth. That night, he demanded to see his personal jester, the order a joke, something light and funny, anything to cheer him up. The jester delivered. According to historical records, the joke went something like, "Why were you late?" Sire asked the king. The jester replied, "Because I saw a young deer hanging by its tail from a fig tree and wondered if it was divine punishment." Now, maybe it was the timing, the delirium, or the fact the king hadn't laughed in ages thanks to digesting a whole goose. Whatever the reason, Martin burst out laughing and couldn't stop. Within minutes, he was gasping for air, clutching his stomach, and collapsed. Official cause of death: indigestion and uncontrollable laughter. Yep, King Martin of Aragon literally laughed himself to death. A death both tragic and utterly embarrassing. You'd think kings should die heroically on the battlefield, in a marble hall, or at least during a dramatic monologue. Martin. He kicked the bucket over a joke about a deer and a fig tree echoing in his ears. The succession crisis that followed dragged the Aragonese crown into messy politics, but no one could discuss it without stifling a smirk. Advisors probably struggled to write reports with straight faces. His Majesty passed away, laughing so hard he couldn't breathe. Martin's death became a legend, proof that, yes, humor can kill, so laugh wisely, especially after dinner. Emperor Qin Shi Huang died because of immortality. If anyone was determined not to die, it was Emperor Qin Shi Huang, China's first unifier and the kind of ruler who didn't just dream of immortality, he demanded it, ascending the throne in the 3rd century BC. Emperor Qin Shi Huang was a powerhouse. He standardized currency, weights, and Chinese writing, built roads, walls, and armies. He even commissioned the legendary terracotta army life-sized clay soldiers meant to guard him in the afterlife. Except Spoiler alert. He never planned to die. Obsessed with living forever, he ordered court alchemists and physicians to make that dream real. Their solution: mercury pills. Seriously, tiny, shiny, toxic pills marketed as the ultimate anti-aging potion. The science behind it: nada. But hey, it looks shiny and impressive. And in ancient China, shiny usually meant power. So the emperor, convinced he was literally drinking his own life force, started popping mercury pills daily, not just once in a while, every single day. Result: his health tanked. He turned paranoid, moody, and kept ghosting the court for long stretches, on a secret trip to check out some eastern land, hoping to snag some magical anti-aging ingredients. He suddenly collapsed and died, ironically poisoned by the very stuff he thought would make him immortal. The court freaked out. His death was kept hush-hush for days to avoid political chaos. Meanwhile, his entourage supposedly hauled around a cart of rotting fish to mask the smell of his rapidly decomposing corpse. Yep. The emperor was so scared of death, he ended up fermenting next to seafood. To this day, the tomb of Qin Shi Huang remains unopened, a secret mountain. Some scholars think it might be surrounded by rivers of liquid mercury. Makes sense, right? He wanted to be preserved forever. And in a way, he was just not as an immortal legend, but as a cautionary tale about trusting dodgy science and shiny pills. Now, onto Pope John the XXIII, a scandal even heaven tried to forget. The papacy has seen its fair share of drama, political plots, religious reforms, crusades, schisms, but few popes rocked the chaos boat like John the XXIII, born Octavianus. He snagged the papal throne in 955 AD at the tender age of 18, leading millions spiritually before you can even rent a horse-drawn carriage. Not exactly a recipe for success, the outcome. Things got worse. John the X quickly became famous, not for sermons, but scandals. His papal palace was more frat house than holy headquarters. He gambled. He drank. He's accused of making a 10-year-old a bishop. He blessed a guy's mistress. He even toasted the devil during Mass. So it's no shocker his death was equally unorthodox. Historians say Pope John the XXIII died of a stroke, but not while praying or on the altar. Nope, he had a stroke while in bed with a married woman. Yep, catch that line. The Pope died mid-affair with someone else's wife. That's not just scandalous, that's a moral black hole. To be fair, the Vatican never officially confirmed this, probably because all official records were written by monks who didn't want to die of embarrassment. But the rumors spread like wildfire, even centuries later. Historians can't agree if it's true or just an epic smear campaign. But imagine the poor monk tasked with writing the eulogy. Here lies Pope John the XXIII, shepherd of the faithful, Christ's representative, and frequent visitor of other people's bedrooms. His death marked the end of one of the most famously unholy papacies. He ruled less than a decade, but in that short time, he blurred almost every line between saintly and sleazy. So Pope John the XXIII makes the list not just for how he died, but for how spectacularly he checked out on the job. He showed up, sinned, had a stroke, and history never forgot. Now, on to King Alexander of Greece. Yeah, the monkey business. Royal duties can be dangerous wars, assassination plots, poisoned drinks, but King Alexander of Greece. He died because of a monkey. Yep, an actual monkey, in 1920. Greece was teetering on political chaos, and young Alexander, pretty green and inexperienced, was shoved on the throne while his dad was exiled. He wasn't really running the show, more like a royal seat warmer. So imagine the shock when news broke the king was attacked in the royal gardens by a gang of monkeys. Here's how it went down. One afternoon, Alexander was strolling the palace grounds with his beloved dog when suddenly a Barbary macaque, those clever but insanely temperamental monkeys, showed up. This monkey belonged to a palace staffer who apparently thought it was chill to let monkeys roam near royalty. Predictably, dog and monkey started biting each other, and like any loyal pet owner, Alexander jumped in to break it up. Then a second monkey appeared. Two monkeys, not thrilled about royal meddling, turned on Alexander's legs with non-stop bites. At first, the wounds didn't look too bad. He got some first aid, no big deal, but a few days later, infection set in, then gangrene, then sepsis. Within 3 weeks, the king of Greece was dead from monkey bites. The fallout was brutal. His death triggered a constitutional crisis, forced his dad back on the throne, and plunged Greece into even deeper turmoil. Yep, a monkey attack sparked global political chaos. The press didn't know how to handle this. Bitten by a monkey doesn't exactly scream royal obituary, so they toned it down with vague phrases like unfortunate wound or sudden illness. But the truth can't hide it. Alexander's reign ended thanks to a monkey bite. Short and mostly forgettable, but his death, now that's unforgettable. The guy wore a crown, yet got taken down by two tiny primates that history couldn't even bother to name. So here's the weirdest royal riddle answered. Which king died because of a monkey fight? King Charles II of Navarre dead, thanks to a candle. When you think royal deaths, you imagine swords, poison, or at least a dramatic fainting spell after a scandalous party. But Charles II, oh no, he went out in a way both ridiculous and slightly explosive. The story kicks off late 14th century, with Charles II, also known as Charles the Bedtime. That was his official nickname, looking pretty rough. He was sick, like really sick, probably from some chronic decline caused by a lifetime of political backstabbing and drama. His doctors, armed with medieval medical wisdom, read none, came up with a cutting-edge cure, wrapping the king head to toe in linen soaked in brandy. Yep, brandy bandages, because when you have no clue, just dunk your king in booze. The idea warm him up, draw out the illness, maybe soak him back to health. Could have worked. If the last step wasn't sewing him into a linen cocoon and having a servant come along to cut the stitches. Then comes the candle, the servant, working late by flickering candlelight, bends down to snip the thread when, according to court historians telling this, with a mix of horror and dark glee, the flame touches the linen. Remember, the king was soaked in brandy, so surprise. He burst into flames like a torch. Chaos ensued. Shouts, panic, probably some nobles fainting in the hallway. But by the time they put out the fire, it was too late. Charles II died in the most embarrassing way possible, roasted alive by his own servant. The irony thick as molasses, a man who spent his life scheming, poisoning rivals, switching sides, betraying kings, finally taken down by a brandy-soaked bandage and a careless assistant. So Charles the Bad, who ruled with fire and fear, ended his days exactly like kindling. Lesson learned: never mix royal medicine with open flames, especially if your nickname is already the Bad. King Edmund II died on the toilet. Some royal deaths are dramatic, so some symbolic. But England's Edmund II, he supposedly kicked the bucket in the most vulnerable position ever sitting on the porcelain throne. Nicknamed Edmund Ironside because second didn't sound tough enough. He ruled for just 7 months in 1016. His nickname came from his battlefield guts and refusal to bow to the Danish king Knut the Great, who was eyeing England back then. Edmund fought like a lion surviving defeat, betrayal, and political chaos. He was the classic tough Anglo-Saxon king right until the end, when all his war glory got totally overshadowed by what happened on the toilet. According to a persistent and ridiculously detailed medieval rumor, Edmund was assassinated while doing his business. Wait, what an assassin, who apparently knew the king's bathroom schedule, hid under the wooden seat, and when Edmund sat down, stabbed him upward out of nowhere. Creepy, right? Not exactly graceful. Official records are vague. Some say he died from battle wounds. Others mention a secret, unnamed conspiracy. But some historians, probably blessed with wild imaginations, describe the scene down to the last inch, the killer hiding in the privy and stabbing from below. Sounds like a political smear, but it sticks around because nothing wrecks a king's rep like getting ambushed on the toilet. Picture it, Edmund, maybe humming a victory tune, finally sitting down after a long campaign, thinking he's earned a moment of peace, only to be betrayed from below. Not exactly a royal portrait, more like bar tale material to warn your mates. To be fair, if the assassination happened, it was a pretty clever plan. The king is at his most helpless on the throne. No armor, no guards, no sword, just underwear, gravity, and blind faith in 11th century plumbing, real or legend. Edmund II's death reminds us even Ironsides have their weak moments, especially sitting down. King Henry the remembered too much. Eel, of all the deadly royal pleasures in history, England's Henry III probably deserves the best fall award, because in 1135, after ruling for over 30 years, surviving wars, power struggles, and rebellious nobles, he finally got defeated by, wait for it, a plate of eel. If you don't know, eels are jawless fish that look like slimy, medieval torture devices. Back then, they were a delicacy, now more like nightmare noodles. But Henry was obsessed. The guy was famously hooked. The royal doctors, clueless but guessing anyway, warned him repeatedly not to eat too much eel. It was considered fatty food, hard to digest, potentially deadly. Did Henry listen? Of course not. He was king. What's the point of being king if you don't break the medical rules? So on a trip to Normandy, Henry sat down at a big banquet and devoured a ton of eel, like seriously. A slippery, slimy feast. No frying, no fancy sauce. They probably just boiled it and piled it up in a gloomy heap. Before long, the guy got seriously sick stomach cramps, vomiting, fever, the classic royal digestive meltdown. A few days later, he died. Official cause: food poisoning. His body was embalmed and shipped back to England in the biting winter cold. There are some gruesome details about that trip I'm not going to share here. Let's just say preserving a corpse in 12th century Europe was no picnic. Historians agree he was a talented, sometimes ruthless king, but none of that matters when your weird obsession with eelfish lands you 6 feet under. Legend has it the doctors begged him to ditch that dish. His reply, "I'd rather die than give up eel." Well, mission accomplished. James II of Scotland was blown to bits by his own cannon. Kings have died in battle, kings have died of illness. But James II, he died because he got way too close to his own cannon. That was in 1460. He was only 29 young, ambitious, famous for 2 things: a temper hotter than a kiln, and a borderline unhealthy obsession with artillery. Back then, Cannons were the shiny new toys of war. And by shiny new toys, I mean giant, unpredictable firecrackers that could blow your leg off at any moment. At the time, James was besieging Roxburgh Castle, still held by the English, wanting to show off his brand new cannons. James ordered a demonstration and naturally wanted front row seats, because what could possibly go wrong standing just a few feet from a 15th century iron tube packed with gunpowder? Spoiler a lot. The moment they fired, boom, the cannon exploded instantly, violently, and spectacularly. A chunk of the barrel tore through James's thigh, severed his leg, and according to some reports, even took out part of his torso. The blast was so intense he died almost immediately. His crew, probably still figuring out what you just blew yourself up means, freaked out and ran for it. The king's death threw the Scottish army into chaos for a bit, but luckily, they rallied and took the castle. They even renamed it James's Castle, probably as a cheeky tribute to the king who donated his body to the cause. A very Scottish ending, dramatic, noisy, and involving at least one medieval tech fail of epic proportions. The ironic twist, James was a huge fan of modernizing Scottish artillery. He loved the noise, the smoke, the power, just not the basic safety rule of don't stand so close. Today, James II is remembered not for politics, but as one of the few kings in history literally blown up by his own enthusiasm. Now, onto Emperor Elagabalus, so bizarre, he couldn't even survive himself. If the Roman Empire needed a poster child for maybe tone it down, it would be Elagabalus, born Varius Avitus. Bassianus already sounds like a magic spell. He became emperor in 218 AD at just 14 years old. That's right. A teenage emperor, mixed godlike power, massive wealth, and zero chill. And you get Rome's weirdest reign. Elagabalus didn't just bend the rules, he melted them down and made jewelry. He appointed a horse as a government official. A popular move among Roman eccentrics, insisted people call him empress instead of emperor, and once hosted a party where he showered guests with so many rose petals, some actually suffocated. His personal life was a mess too. Rumor has it he married 5 times, including once to a Vestal virgin, which was, illegal, and he was famous for dressing in women's clothes, wearing makeup, and promising to pay any doctor who could turn him into a woman for good. Today, we might call him gender non-conforming or fluid. Back then in ancient Rome, that made him a walking scandal wrapped in a toga, while his wild behavior shocked the Roman elite. What really got him in hot water was his blatant disrespect for Roman religious traditions. He tried to replace Jupiter, king of the gods, with Elagabalus, a sun god from Syria. He even built a massive temple and made senators watch him dance around a sacred black stone. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard, the Roman Secret Service, but with more daggers, got fed up. In 222 AD, they assassinated Elagabalus and his mom. Their bodies were dragged through the streets and dumped in the Tiber River. And the Roman Empire hit the reset button. Elagabalus died at 18. The Roman gods got dissed hard. This guy tried swapping out Jupiter, king of the gods, for Elagabalus, some sun god from Syria. He even built a massive temple and forced senators to watch him dance around a sacred black stone. Classic power move, right? But the Praetorian Guard, the Roman Secret Service, with more daggers and less patience, had enough. In 222 AD, they offed Elagabalus and his mom, dragged their bodies through the streets, chucked them in the Tiber, and hit the Roman Empire's reset button. Elagabalus died at 18. A teenager with way too much power, way too many parties, and zero self-control. Historians still argue if he was a misunderstood prophet or just a chaotic whirlwind in silk robes. But one thing's clear, his reign was bizarre, wild, and Rome had zero tolerance left. Now, Catherine the Great. Rumors outlived her. Few rulers in history have had a rep as grand and as scandalously misunderstood as Catherine the Great of Russia. She was a brilliant reformer, an art patron, a political powerhouse who expanded the Russian Empire and even exchanged letters with Voltaire. But mention her name at a party, and someone will probably mutter something about a horse. Let me be clear, no. Catherine did not die in some cozy rendezvous with a stallion. That ridiculous, messy, totally false story cooked up by her enemies after she died. Zero historical basis, and says way more about 18th century tabloid nonsense than about Catherine. The real story, she died of a stroke in 1796 at 67 in the bathroom. That's it. She collapsed in her private chamber and never woke up. Quiet, unglamorous, and totally human. But where did the horse rumor come from throughout her reign? Catherine made powerful enemies at home and abroad. She was a woman ruling a male empire, unapologetically smart and famous for her fiery personal life. Sure, she had lovers like many kings before her, but the difference, Catherine's conquests were documented and dragged through the mud, while her male peers got cheered on. After her death, bitter political rivals and nobles jumped at the chance to tarnish her legacy. The horse rumor, vulgar and absurd, was designed to keep the shame going, not because anyone really believed it, but because it was shockingly unforgettable, like a nasty royal tabloid headline no one wants to disappear. So, while Catherine was busy expanding Russia's borders, modernizing the government, and dragging the empire into the Enlightenment, she was haunted by a fake horse story. In the end, she didn't die in tragedy, not on the battlefield. She died like many before her, quietly, privately, and history didn't let her go out with dignity. If there's a lesson here, it's this: power is fleeting, but rumors have long legs, especially when horses are involved. Emperor Valentinian II, the bathtub death. No one really knows how. Most royal deaths are pretty straightforward: war, illness, or a misjudged eel attack. But Roman Emperor Valentinian II, his death's been a mystery floating around, literally, for over 1,600 years. Back in 392 AD, Valentinian was just 21, actually. He'd been emperor since he was 4, because nothing says qualified to rule Rome like still wearing diapers. But, like most kid emperors, someone else was actually pulling the strings. Enter Arbogast, a general who made no effort to hide it. He treated Valentinian like a puppet, pulling the strings backstage. The young emperor wasn't thrilled being a royal marionette and started pushing back. Tensions rose, political whispers turned into threats. The palace air thickened with the scent of sudden death. Then one morning, Valentinian was found dead in his bathtub, not at a fancy party, not stabbed on the Senate floor, just peacefully drowned in a tub. No bruises, no blood, just a young emperor bobbing like the last scene of a terrible detective novel. Arbogast, naturally, said it was suicide, a neat and convenient explanation, but historians have long been skeptical. Valentinian was young, ambitious, and just starting to assert power. Suicide. Yeah, right. Political assassination. Now that's more Roman style, but since no one saw it happen, and forensic science back then was basically, he's not breathing. The real cause of death was never proven. The chaos that followed was even worse. The Western Roman Empire spiraled into turmoil. Arbogast installed another puppet emperor, and civil war broke out all over a corpse in a bathtub and hundreds of unanswered questions. Valentinian Natuda's death might not be the creepiest or dumbest on the list, but it definitely wins the award for most suspiciously quiet. Because if history has taught us anything, it's this: when an emperor dies in a bathtub, someone's probably involved. In the sun-drenched city of Argos, where marble temples shimmer and the sea breeze smells like olive trees, a frail little girl named Telesilla was born into a life full of quiet expectations. Her family was noble rich enough for luxury, educated enough to appreciate poetry, but the daughter was seen as fragile, sickly, and unlikely to leave any mark beyond the shady courtyard. From a young age, Telesilla suffered chronic illness, nobody's quite sure what. Since ancient records weren't exactly known for medical accuracy, she often lay bedridden, watching life from behind linen curtains. In a society obsessed with sports and public presence, especially for men, Telesilla's weakness was basically a death sentence for fame. But fate, or maybe the muses, intervened. Unable to dive into the bustling market or Hera's festivals, Telesilla turned inward and found poetry there. Words and rhythms became her companions. Speech was her rebellion against fate. Instead of breaking down, she started composing poems, reportedly as naturally as breathing. Her verses praised Apollo, Artemis, Athena, the gods of strategy, healing, and war. Pretty ironic, considering what's coming next. And as her poetry deepened, something else changed. Pausanias, an ancient travel writer, claimed that thanks to her devotion to the muses and writing, Telesilla's body began to heal. Slowly but surely, she got stronger. Maybe she took part in purification rituals, or just found a new purpose to rebuild herself. Whatever it was, she didn't just become a poet, she was reborn, with a voice, strength, and clarity that surprised everyone. Over time, her work became widely loved. Her name spread from party to scholarly gathering, and her lyrics stirred the hearts of Argos's women. She didn't just write poetry, she created identity. She gave her city a voice, and though no one knew it yet, that voice wasn't going to echo on a theater stage. It was about to roar on the battlefield. Because this poet wasn't done shocking people, there were plenty more stories to tell. As Telesilla's name rang out in Argos, her home turned into a quiet shrine, not for wealth or beauty, but for her poetry. She wrote with special focus on the gods, especially Apollo and Artemis, the divine siblings of healing, precision, and purity. Her hymns weren't just praise, they invited presence. This wasn't empty ritual, it was a call to awaken the fighting spirit of the soul. Those verses could be recited in temples and holy festivals, sung by choirs of young girls in white dresses, their voices echoing beneath sunburnt stone columns. Through poetry, Telesilla brought spiritual expression and emotional education. She reminded Argos's people, especially women, that they were part of the divine picture too. They weren't just spectators in a man-dominated story. They were woven into the legend, while men debated politics in the market. Telesilla's lines sank deep into the minds of Argos's daughters. In a world where education for women was rare, poetry was their treasure. Her hymns taught respect, strength, even rebellion, all wrapped in metaphor and rhythm. But for Telesilla, it wasn't just literature. Those hymns were medicine. Ancient notes show her strict Poetic discipline helped heal her lifelong illness. Yet you might roll your eyes at the idea of healing through writing, but there's something timeless about it. She found purpose, and maybe from that, resilience. The more she wrote, the stronger she stood. The stronger she stood, the more people listened, and Argos desperately needed her voice. Because war was creeping closer, the city had grown complacent, riding too much on past glory and underestimating the rising tensions around them. Sparta, the stubborn neighbor to the south, had shown its true colors more than once, while Argos' men were still arguing. No one expected a poet, the once frail girl, who healed herself with verse to become the rallying cry. In many ways, Telesilla had been prepping her city all along. Her hymns weren't just comfort, they were training sessions, silent rehearsals for something bigger, bloodier, and more urgent. When the moment came, Argos's women knew the rhythms of resistance because she taught them how to sing it. Around 494 BC, Argos stood on the edge of disaster. Tensions with Sparta finally exploded. The Battle of Sapea broke out, a trap set with Spartan precision and Argive miscalculation, confident in their numbers and tradition. Argos's men fell right into a trap laid by King Cleomenes of Sparta. It was brutal, systematic, a massacre disguised as strategy. Hundreds of Argive soldiers were wiped out. Almost the entire male fighting force of the city was said to be annihilated. What was left was an empty city, gates wide open, warriors dead, fate seemingly sealed. Argos was defenseless, and Sparta knew it perfectly well. What Cleomenes didn't know, and probably nobody saw coming, was that behind those blood-stained walls, there was more than just pain and ruin. There was Telesilla. After the battle, when cries echoed through marble halls and temples, the people of Argos were expected, almost invited, to surrender. You'd think that was a done deal. Lots probably thought that, but just as spirits hit rock bottom, Telesilla stepped up, not with a spear, but with fire in her eyes. She rallied the women, and historians like Plutarch and Pausanias later recorded this story, which is honestly pretty amazing. Telesilla, once a sickly poet, now stood before her people moms, daughters, widows, and told them to grab weapons. For real. They scavenged whatever they could, spears nailed to the walls, shields left by fallen soldiers. Even stones and farm tools got pressed into service. Under the shadow of those ancient walls, women started training old ladies, kids, even servants. Everyone got ready for what was coming. Telesilla organized it all. This wasn't some crazy legend dream. This was a plan. She positioned women on high towers to make it look like Argos was still fully defended. She drilled them in formations. They weren't pros, but they were fierce, determined, and above all, pissed off. The city waited, holding its breath. The Spartans would come back. Everyone knew it. But when they showed up, expecting a broken city ready to surrender, they saw something totally different. A wall of women, weapons in hand, ready to fight, led by a poet with no crown. No title, just authority in her voice. Argos had fallen, sure, but now it was rising again. The Spartans returned, ready to loot. After all, they'd already wiped out Argos's male army. The rest, they figured, was just weak civilians who wouldn't dare resist a walk in the park, and maybe even a lesson in Spartan mercy. But what awaited them at Argos's gate wasn't surrender. It was a show, a challenge. It was Telesilla, the walls lined with women, armed to the teeth, eyes steely, stance solid, their commander. A woman once known only for poetry, now standing tall, commanding tactics like a general born of war. Then the women attacked. This wasn't some glorious, heroic shield wall scene. Nope. This was chaos mad, relentless, and up close. These women fought with whatever they had. Spears jabbed from the walls. Boiling water poured on Spartan helmets. Stones rained down like curses. It was as much psychological warfare as physical. The Spartans, trained, disciplined soldiers, suddenly found themselves wrestling brutal, hand-to-hand combat with people they weren't prepared to kill women. And that hesitation cost them big time. Pausanias, who wrote this down centuries later, said the Argive women under Telesilla's lead forced the Spartans to retreat. Sounds crazy, right? But context matters. The Spartans had already met their main goal. They'd defeated Argos's male army. What they faced now was resistance that could shatter Sparta's unbeatable legend. Losing to a militia led by women wasn't just bad, it was humiliating. And in Sparta, humiliation was worse than death. So they backed off. Think about it, Telesilla, a poet who trained in verse, not weapons, led a group of grieving, angry, determined women to save their city. Not in myth, not metaphor, real history. This victory wasn't just military, it was symbolic. It changed Argos's story. It redefined what women could do in a crisis, and it proved something Sparta never saw coming. Courage doesn't grow a beard, and leadership isn't born only on the battlefield. That day, Argos didn't fall to Sparta. It stood taller than ever, tougher than ever, raised by hands that once only strummed lyres, and it was Telesilla who breathed new life into the city. The victory tasted nothing like anyone expected. Argos survived, but it changed. The streets still echoed with mourning, the temples stained with the blood of husbands, brothers, sons who never came home. But amid all that silence, something extraordinary happened, a legacy stitched together by women's hands and Telesilla's unbreakable will. She didn't seize power. She didn't crown herself queen or sit on a throne. Telesilla went back to her poetry. Sounds a bit anticlimactic, right? But that's her genius. She didn't fight for glory. She fought because the city needed her, and once Argos was safe, she went back to what she loved, writing hymns and praising the gods. But now, her verses carried new weight. They weren't just festival songs. They were reminders, living memories wrapped in rhythm. Imagine the girls of Argos growing up under that victory's shadow, whispering tales about the poet general who led their moms into battle. Imagine their voices humming those lines under moonlight, not just ritual, but power. Telekilla's poetry turned into prophecy, and prophecy set a precedent. The city didn't just honor her with songs, they built statues. One statue stood proudly in the temple of Aphrodite, showing Telesilla sitting calm, scroll at her feet, one hand on a lyre, the other resting on a shield, not a contradiction, but a whole truth. She was both artist and warrior, proving you could be both and that you kinda had to be. News of her spread across Greece like a juicy rumor. Telesilla became a symbol not just of artistic grit, but of female courage in a world that rarely let such stories breathe. Philosophers debated her, poets stole her theme. Over time, her name joined the ranks of legendary women queens, seers, and all that jazz. But maybe the loudest statement she made, the silence after. She didn't crave war. She hated drama. Protecting Argos was necessary, not ego-driven. When peace came, so did she back to ink, rhythm, and that sacred private space where poems are born. And just like that, she proved real power isn't measured by how long you swing a sword, but knowing exactly when to put it down. Telesilla's name traveled far beyond Argos's walls, not by armies, but by fans. Her story, part history, part legend, whispered in workshops, scribbled on scrolls, quietly admired by men who never thought they'd talk about a woman who was both poet and protector. She wasn't mythicized into a goddess. She stayed human, and that made her even stronger. Her dual legacy echoed deeply across Greece. It shattered the mold no one even realized could be broken. In an era where women were expected to be silent, invisible, or just decoration, Telesilla was none of those. Educated, expressive, and fierce when needed. Even her poetry survived the test of time. Some lines still linger, quoted by grammarians and scholars centuries later, fragmented, sure, but full of solemn prayers, vivid images, and sharp ritual insights. She didn't just write, she shaped the sacred. It's hard to say how many of her works vanished into history's black hole. Like many ancient women, her voice survives only in scraps, preserved by men long after she was gone. But even those scraps are enough. They tell of a woman who believed in beauty, community, purpose, and the power of words to build not just poetry but courage, memory, resistance. Later artists painted her surrounded by scrolls and shields, sometimes crowned with a laurel, sometimes just lost in thought, always balancing song and silence, art and action. She inspired generations of women after her, quietly, like a stubborn flame that never quite goes out. In the Hellenistic period and even Roman times, her name popped up in anthologies, a rare female voice in mostly male lineups. Her story wasn't repeated just because it was cool, it was repeated because it mattered. Telesilla of Argos wasn't the loudest warrior or the most prolific poet, but she was rare, a woman walking two worlds with grace, passion, and grit, and by doing that, she forced the world to notice her, not by conquest, but by sheer clarity over centuries. Telesilla's name faded not from myth, but from mainstream history. Like many ancient women, her memory got shoved into footnotes, her achievements mentioned sparingly, and usually with polite surprise, as if a woman doing something extraordinary was some kind of fluke. The Hellenistic world, with its power centers and cultural shakeups, started favoring other heroes, conquerors, philosophers, kings. In this new scene, a female poet who used both brains and will to defend her city wasn't exactly the kind of story empires liked to tell. By the time Roman writers mentioned her, her story was almost legend. Plutarch brought her up with a rhetorical eyebrow raise, barely caring about her poetry or politics. Just shocked some woman ever held power. To him and many contemporaries, Telesilla was a rare exception, a strange flower in a garden full of men. But history is the real traitor, because Telekilla wasn't the only one erased from the spotlight. Plenty of women like her leaders, thinkers, poets were overlooked because their stories were too complicated to preserve whole. Scrolls got lost, statues got repurposed or smashed. Voices weren't silenced by violence, but by centuries of editorial neglect. Yet Telesilla survived. Her story wasn't kept because it was allowed, but because it was too damn compelling to erase. Picture a woman standing on the city walls, shield in hand, one hand clutching a poem, simply refusing to shut up. That image never fades away. It simmers in memory, flares up in crises, and whispers to every new generation that courage wears many faces. Some even come with a hood nowadays. Historians and feminists are revisiting her legacy not to hype it up, but to reclaim it. Dust off the silence and see what happens when a woman's full story stands shoulder to shoulder with her male peers. And through that, we don't just remember Telesilla, we remember what history tried to forget. Sure, most of ancient Greece is a crumbling mess, statues worn smooth, scrolls turned to dust. But Telesilla's legacy stubbornly survives in three tough forms: stone, paper, and sisterhood. First up, stone, in the ancient Aphrodisian Argos temple. After the war drums faded, there stood Telesilla, not some giant marble statue, but a quiet memorial. She's carved sitting silently, scattered scrolls at her feet, hand resting on her helmet, no sword raised high, no heroic stance, just a calm moment. The image of a woman who knew how to blend art with action. Even her spot in the temple was intentional, not Athena, goddess of war and wisdom, but Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and maybe, just maybe, resilience, a quiet revolution etched in stone. Then come the scrolls. Most of Telesilla's poems are gone, but what's left reveals a voice full of reverence and clarity. Scholars over centuries pieced her lines together, finding not just art, but deep emotional insight. Her style purely lyrical, intimate, melodic, dripping with spiritual passion. She didn't write for applause, she wrote for souls. Maybe that's why her words outlasted her battles. And finally, sisterhood. Telesilla's story became a secret anthem for women across time, especially those barred from swords, voting booths, or recognition. She gave them something longer lasting than tactics: permission to act, speak up, lead, protect. She wasn't just a historical figure, she was a mirror where generations of women could glimpse their own potential. No matter how much time tried to blur it, her story inspired plays, poems, even academic theses. In feminist takes on ancient history, she's no footnote anymore. She's a foundation, reminding us that when institutions go silent, individuals can still scream. When history slams doors shut, memory cracks open a window. In classrooms, books, whispered talks among those craving forgotten heroines, Telesilla lives. She's the patron saint of the underrated. The poet didn't just sing about heroes, she became one. Telesilla never begged to be remembered. She didn't order statues or plead for her name in history books. Yet here we are, over 2,000 years later, still saying her name, telling her story, still amazed at what she pulled off in a world that wanted to forget women like her. What makes her legacy so compelling isn't just that she fought or wrote, but that she did both when no one expected or allowed it. A fragile girl clutching a lyre who was never supposed to lead an army. A woman. Writing hymns wasn't meant to change a city's fate, but she did it. And not with divine intervention or noble birthright, but with clear-eyed purpose and iron will. In the grand tapestry of Greek history, full of muscle-bound heroes and dramatic capes, Telesilla stands out differently. She didn't roar like Achilles or scheme like Odysseus. She did something way harder. She stood firm, stared down the abyss without blinking, not because she wasn't scared, but because someone had to act and no one else would. That's why her echo still rings. This reminds us that heroes don't always burst in with trumpet blasts or poets' praise. Sometimes it's a woman gripping a sword with shaking hands, standing tall, saying, "Not today, buddy." Today, scholars and artists keep drawing inspiration from her. Her story is taught in feminist courses, brought up in talks about women at war, even used to debate how flexible gender and class roles can be. She's not just Argos's symbol, She's a symbol of resistance, if you listen closely. Her voice still hums beneath modern tales in every woman who steps up when others step back, in every artist who refuses to stay in line, in every brave act that starts with a whisper and ends with thunder. Telesilla's legacy isn't locked in the past. It's alive, breathing, quietly spreading worldwide. Because here's the truth: liars never really get knocked down. They just get sharper before arches, blueprints, or even the idea of architecture. Humans just had one simple problem: how to get from one side of the river to the other, across raging rivers, deep canyons, and deadly cliffs. Our ancient ancestors faced the eternal travel question: what do you do when the land just disappears? The first bridges weren't built by engineers. Nope. They were stumbled upon by wanderers and hunters who noticed a fallen tree or a vine stretched across a gorge. These crossings weren't planned, they were lucky finds. Nature gave a hint. Humans copied it. A fallen tree here. A row of rocks perfectly placed there. Boom. A bridge was born out of curiosity, fear, and hunger over time. Those accidental paths became deliberate. In rainforests, people started tying vines and reeds into hanging walkways. Not exactly the safest stroll, you'd probably avoid it at night, but it was a start. A lifeline connecting hunger to food, isolation to community. In some parts of today's South America, early civilizations twisted plant fibers into longer suspension bridges. These weren't just rough ropes. They were woven, reinforced, and fine-tuned over centuries. The Incas, way before the Spanish showed up, perfected the art of rope bridges, but even before the Inca Empire, Andean folks mastered techniques demanding deep knowledge of tension, weight distribution, and natural materials. What made these first bridges amazing wasn't size, it was guts. Imagine standing before 100-meter deep canyon, and instead of running away, you start tying grass together. That's not just skill, that's courage wrapped in pure necessity. These first crossings didn't just change routes, they changed relationships. Once two valleys were linked, ideas flowed as easily as people. Trade routes popped up, languages mixed, cultural exchange got born on shaky ropes and soggy planks. A bridge, no matter how humble, was always more than wood and fiber. It was an invitation, a statement, a quiet refusal to let nature have the final word. On those first bridges, civilizations took their first steps toward connection and never looked back. Up high in the Andes, where cliffs stand like razor blades and rivers roar with melting ice, the Inca Empire wove the answer to nature's harsh geography. The Incas didn't just build bridges, they connected the sky. Their roads stretched thousands of miles across mountains and valleys, but it was their rope bridges, called Quisquachaca, that truly blew minds. These bridges were made entirely from grass. No wood, no metal, no stone, just ichu, a tough mountain grass, twisted into ropes. Then those ropes twisted into cables. This process was more than technique. It was a ritual. The whole village gathered yearly to build or repair these bridges by hand. Each family took responsibility for a section of rope. They braided, chanted, and pulled, working to rhythms passed down for generations. The bridge could span a 30-meter gorge, swaying with every mountain breeze. No nails, no bolts, just tension and pure faith. Yet these rope bridges were strong enough to carry llamas, soldiers, messengers, and merchants. They were the lifeblood arteries of an empire stretching across ravines where no stone could be placed. And they had their own kind of charm. hanging like spiderwebs over empty space. They moved with the wind instead of fighting it. They bent, swayed, sighed, but rarely broke. When one did collapse, it wasn't a failure. It was just the end of a cycle, waiting to be reborn by the hands of those living along its path. These rope bridges weren't just constructions, they were sacred. Rebuilding them every year was a living ritual, reminding folks that land isn't for conquering, but for collaborating. That connection wasn't made by brute force, but by harmony. No empire got this more than the Incas. Even today, there's still a working rope bridge, the last Quizhuachaca, rebuilt annually by local communities near Huincho. Peru, UNESCO calls it intangible cultural heritage. Tourists tiptoe across it. Locals cross it like it's second nature, in a world fast forgetting how to fix things. The Inca Bridge reminds us of something ancient, and crucial strength isn't always about stone. Sometimes it comes from woven grass, shared labor, and the will to cross the gap, far away from the windy Andes. Crossing rivers in ancient China, a whole new philosophy of bridge building was brewing. Think durability over flexibility, symmetry over wobble. Chinese engineers didn't see bridges as just tools. They were symbols of balance between earth, water, and sky, all tied together with stone. Back in the Zhou dynasty, builders tried wooden and pontoon bridges, but it wasn't until the Han, then Sui and Tang dynasties, that the segmented arch bridge really showed up, not soaring like Roman arches, but flatter, giving the bridge a gentle, stable slope when loaded with ox carts or beasts of burden. This wasn't just about looks, it was a masterclass in tension and compression. Take the Xiao Bridge, built in the early 7th century by engineer Li Chun. It's 123 feet long, with a 37-foot high arch. One of the oldest open-arch stone bridges still standing, not just ancient, but seriously clever. Li Chun added smaller arches underneath to cut weight and water resistance. During floods, his grasp of structure and natural forces was way ahead of his time. But Chinese bridges weren't just engineering marvels, they were downright poetic. Many stood near temples or gardens, reflecting Taoist ideals and the blurry line between order and chaos. A bridge wasn't just a crossing, it was a moment, a pause between 2 points to contemplate the still water below and the swirling sky above. Stone lions often guarded the entrance, not just for show, but as symbols of protection. Bridge names were picked carefully, often hinting at luck, long life, or spiritual awakening, for Tang and Song scholars and artists. Bridges became favorite subjects in paintings and poetry. A single step across a bridge could mean everything change, connection, and the quiet power of motion in ancient China. Bridges weren't just civil engineering, they were spiritual geometry. Every stone laid was both technical and philosophical. Crossing a bridge wasn't just moving, it was stepping into balance. If China built bridges with harmony, then Rome built theirs with ambition. For the Romans, a bridge wasn't just a river crossing, it was a declaration: we are here, and we will endure. As the Roman Empire expanded, they faced countless rivers, valleys, and gorges, but where others saw obstacles, Romans saw blueprints. They inherited the arch tech from the Etruscans and turned it into something grand and lasting, using stone, concrete, and pure stubbornness. Roman engineers built bridges not just to survive time, but to define it. One of the most famous bridges is the Pons Fabricius, built in 62 BC, still letting pedestrians cross the Tiber today, over 2 millennia of rain, war, floods, and foot traffic, and it's still standing. The secret sauce of Roman bridges lies in the arch. Roman arches spread weight evenly, channeling force to the ground. This allowed bridges to span wider rivers and carry heavier loads, with the invention of pozzolanic concrete that hardens underwater. Romans had flexibility their rivals could only dream of, but Rome didn't build bridges just to use them. These bridges were built to wow. They were often clad in marble or limestone. Here's the Pons Fabricius again, built in 62 BC, still letting folks stroll across the Tiber. More than 2,000 years of wars, floods, and footsteps later, and it's still holding strong. The genius of Roman bridges is in the arch. Roman arches distribute weight evenly, sending force to the ground, thanks to pozzolanic concrete that sets underwater. Roman builders had a flexibility their competition couldn't match. But for Rome, function alone wasn't enough. These bridges were built grand. They were usually faced with marble or limestone, inscribed with emperors' names, decorated with statues and victory slogans. Some were even designed as part of aqueducts, like the stunning Pont du Gard in modern-day France, serving both as water channels and massive architectural statements. For Roman legions, bridges meant speed. For Roman traders, bridges meant prosperity. And for the empire, bridges meant endurance. Roman roads are famous for being straight and solid, but it's the bridges that gave those roads meaning wherever Rome went. Bridges followed both literally and figuratively, linking conquest to civilization. A bridge wasn't just infrastructure, it was a mini empire, neat, strong, and built to last. Even after the empire fell, many Roman bridges remained, used, rebuilt, and reimagined. The stones whisper tales of times when engineers walked beside emperors, and when rivers, no matter how wide or wild, had to bow to Roman will. Crossing a Roman bridge is like stepping in the footsteps of conquerors and feeling the weight of eternity beneath your feet. While Rome built with stone and China built with symmetry, ancient India quietly grew a totally different bridge tradition, living bridges not cut wood, not ropes, not carved beams, but actual living. Growing trees in the wet hills of Meghalaya in northeast India, rivers fed by relentless monsoon rains sweep away bamboo bridges, ropes, and wood like toothpicks. But for centuries, the Khasi and Jaintia people figured out how to use nature not as a hurdle, but as an ally. They started training the roots of the Ficus elastica, a rubber fig tree, to slowly and patiently stretch across streams and rivers over years, then decades. Those roots were guided using hollowed trunks, scaffolding, and bamboo frames, coaxed to grow toward the opposite bank. When roots met, they were woven and anchored into the ground, forming a living, breathing bridge. These living root bridges don't rot, don't crack or crumble. In fact, they only get stronger with age. A young bridge might take 15 years before you can dare to cross it. But once mature, it can last hundreds of years, nourished by the very soil it stands on. This isn't fast architecture. It's the architecture of generations. Grandpa might start weaving a bridge that his great-great-grandkid might one day stroll across. No blueprints here, just tradition, no calculations, just intuition handed down through watching, doing, and remembering. And these bridges aren't just functional, they're stunning, hanging like magic between waterfalls and lush valleys. The root bridges twist and turn like fairy tales, organic and surreal, blending into the forest as if born from myth. In a world obsessed with speed, India's living bridges are a slow jam of defiance. They show that time, care, and cooperation with nature can create wonders as lasting as stone. Their community projects, sacred paths, reminders that not all strength is rigid. Sometimes it's woven, flexible, alive. Crossing a root bridge is stepping into a different rhythm of civilization where you listen to the earth rather than try to boss it around. And in this quiet balance, India didn't just build bridges over rivers, they built bridges to the wild itself, in the cradle of civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates slice through desert and city. The ancient Mesopotamians faced a familiar dilemma, rivers that both nourished and divided. These waterways brought trade, irrigation, and life, but they also created borders, and wherever there's a border, someone's got to build a bridge. Unlike later empires flexing with stone and steel, ancient Mesopotamians made do with what they had: mud bricks, wood, and a healthy dose of ingenuity. Their rivers were wide but not bottomless. Materials were fragile, but their smarts weren't. Babylon, a jewel of ancient Mesopotamia, was famously split by the Euphrates, yet also famous for connection. Greek historian Herodotus tells of a floating wooden bridge on boats tied with papyrus ropes. By day, it carried people and carts. By night, it was taken apart to keep enemies at bay. Whether this tale is fact or poetic flair, it reveals a truth. Mesopotamian cities weren't isolated pods, they were logistical masterpieces. Bridges weren't just architecture, they were strategy. Some were low and temporary, rebuilt after floods. Others made of fired bricks and bitumen mortar, set deep into mud and clay foundations. The Mesopotamians understood the river's mood. They didn't try to conquer water with brute force. They worked around, above, and even below it. Caravans carrying grain, cloth, and lapis lazuli needed bridges. Temples and ziggurats drew pilgrims from both banks, and kings, always eager to control, knew whoever held the bridge held the city. Over time, as empires like Assyria and Persia rose, bridges got more complex. Engineers started using stone piles and sturdier wooden spans, but the roots of this engineering came from the simplest acts: tying reeds, packing clay, hauling wood. The why of building bridges existed long before the how. Mesopotamian bridges might not have lasted centuries like Rome's or inspired poetry like China's, but they laid the groundwork. They were the first bones of infrastructure, the backbone of organized society. They taught us that where there's trade, there must be connection, and where there's water, there will always be someone trying to cross it. For the ancient Greeks, known for its connections, Greek historian Herodotus tells us that Babylon had a wooden floating bridge resting on boats tied together with papyrus ropes. By day, the bridge carried people and carts. By night, it was dismantled to block enemy passage. Whether this story is fully true or a bit poetic, it reflects a fact: Mesopotamian cities weren't isolated, they were logistics masterpieces. Bridges weren't just architecture, they were strategy. Some were low and temporary, rebuilt after floods. Others were made of baked bricks and bitumen mortar, set deep in mud and clay. The Mesopotamians knew rivers had moods. They didn't try to boss the water around with brute force. They worked around it, over it, and even under it. Caravans hauling grain, cloth, and lapis lazuli needed bridges. Temples and ziggurats pulled pilgrims from both shores, and kings, always eager to control something new, whoever held the bridge held the city's leash. Over time, as empires like Assyria and Persia rose, bridges got fancier. Engineers started using stone piles and sturdier wooden spans. But the tech roots came from the simplest moves: tying reeds, packing clay, dragging wood. The why behind building bridges existed way before the how. Mesopotamian bridges might not last centuries, like Rome's, or inspire poetry like China's, but they laid the groundwork. They were the first signs of infrastructure, the backbone of organized society. They taught us this: where there's trade, there's gotta be connection, and where there's water, someone's always trying to cross it. For the ancient Greeks, the world wasn't just a place to live, it was a canvas to shape, measure, and perfect. When it came to bridges, they fussed over proportion, harmony, and technique, just like their temples and statues. Unlike the Romans, the Greeks weren't obsessed with building long bridges or flexing imperial muscles. Their bridges were modest but clever, spanning small rivers, marshes, or rocky gorges. These builds balanced form and function with quiet finesse, like the Artico Bridge over in the Peloponnese, dating back to the Bronze Age around 1300 BCE, one of the oldest stone arch bridges still standing today, built from huge limestone blocks with no mortar. It's silently holding up underfoot just like it did thousands of years ago. No inscriptions, no imperial eagles, no sky-high arches, just a simple, elegant span built with steady precision and grace. The Greeks knew stone, they understood load-bearing, and maybe most importantly, they got the whole community connecting thing. Many of their roads and bridges formed sacred routes used in religious festivals and processions to temples, like the long pilgrimage to Delphi or Olympia. In those moments, bridges weren't just for getting around, they led people straight to the gods. Later, during the classical and Hellenistic periods, Greek cities started borrowing and tweaking more advanced engineering from the Etruscans and the East, wood and stone combined. Some bridges even had drainage systems, carefully calculated slopes, and protective railings, but aesthetics still mattered. Greek bridges weren't just tools, they blended into the landscape, beautifying without overpowering. They often placed bridges in scenic spots, creating perfect balance with hills and sky water below, air above, stone in the middle. Greeks loved balance. To them, a bridge wasn't just a crossing, it was a metaphor movement between worlds, cities, gods and mortals, chaos and order. So even if their spans weren't as long as the Romans, Greek bridges whispered quietly in stone, strong, serene, and built to last, with thought, not thunder, in the land of massive pyramids and mighty pharaohs. Ancient Egypt didn't need to conquer rivers as much as control them. The Nile, giver and taker of life, was seen more as a lifeline than a barrier. Boats were Egypt's bridges, but that didn't mean Egyptians ignored the art of crossing land gaps when they built bridges. It was with clear purpose and unmistakable symbolism. Egyptian civilization grew along the fertile Nile banks, full of irrigation canals, ditches, and water distribution inland. To manage this watery maze, they developed small bridges, flat stone paths, wooden crossings, and canal bridges, mostly for function, not show. One of the earliest examples comes from the workers' village of Deir el Medina, near the Valley of the Kings. Archaeologists found narrow stone walkways and raised paths designed so pedestrians could cross irrigation ditches and dips in the land. Nothing grand, but smartly built with local stone, carefully leveled surfaces, and following main routes. Then there were the big roads, long, sloped stone paths linking the Nile to the Giza pyramids. Not technically bridges, but these roads acted like ritual connectors between the river and the tombs of the dead, huge and meticulously built. They moved pharaohs' funeral goods, chariots, even their mummies in grand religious processions. In these roads, we don't just see transport, we see spiritual transition, a journey from life to death, from this world to the next. Bridges in Egypt weren't always just structures you walked over. They were ideas, souls crossing over, kings moving from dusty mortal life to eternal divine status. As Egypt expanded and urbanized, more bridges popped up over canals and smaller waterways, often linked to temples or granary systems. Some were wooden and lost to time, but foundations, stone piers, and embankments still lie buried beneath deserts and fields. Egyptian bridges were never monuments of conquest. They were pathways of water, grain, and sacred memory, maybe not flashy, but huge in meaning, the eternal journey between this shore and the other, the seen and unseen. When the ancient world started giving way to the Middle Ages, those bridges stayed silent, unmoving witnesses to the ambitions, fears, and smarts of early civilizations. Some fell apart, swallowed by floods or forgotten wars. Others stood firm root bridges in India, Roman arches in France, Greek limestone bridges in the Peloponnese. Silent but unbroken, what ties all these ancient bridges together, whether made from grass, stone, wood, or myth, is that they are acts of faith, not necessarily religious faith, but human faith, that we can cross divisions, that we can connect what nature has split apart, that what's on the other side is worth reaching for. Every civilization had its own style. The Inca used tension, the Romans compression, the Chinese curves, Mesopotamians buoyancy, but the principle was the same link, what can't be left behind. Make distance meaningless. And each bridge tells the story of its builders. The Inca believed in time. The Greeks believed in balance. The Egyptians believed in immortality. The Romans, they believed in concrete. But bridges aren't just about function or philosophy. They tell stories. A suspension bridge whispers community. A Roman aqueduct roars empire. A Chinese stone arch talks harmony. They don't just carry people, they carry faith, identity, and purpose. Some bridges were born in emergencies, thrown up after wars or floods. Others grew from ritual, lifted by song, rebuilt in ceremonies, kept alive not by kings but by peasants and kids. All needed teamwork. No one builds a bridge solo. It takes hands, patience, and hope. Maybe that's why bridges still echo with us today, not because we admire ancient tools or clever math, but because we recognize the courage it takes to build something between danger and safety, isolation and connection, now and the future, in a world that often tears itself apart. Ancient bridges remind us of something peaceful, ancient, and wise connection is worth the effort. Strength can be gentle, and sometimes the strongest thing we do is just reach out. So next time, when you stroll across an ancient bridge, pause for a sec. You're literally walking on the footprints of ancient dreams, and they're still standing strong, way before clay tablets or temple choirs. There was sound, not the organized music we know, but raw, instinctive rhythm, a nature symphony just waiting to be noticed. The crackle of fire, rain tapping a beat, rustling leaves, thudding footsteps that was the first orchestra, and somewhere along the way, ancient folks didn't just hear it, they started to mimic it. The oldest instruments we know come from the Old Stone Age. Think bone flutes from birds and mammoth tusks found in German caves, clocking in at over 40,000 years old. They had carefully drilled holes to change pitch, not just make noise. These weren't toys, they were emotional tools. Imagine someone softly blowing into a carved bone in a flickering cave sound echoing like whispers through stone, a lullaby, a hunting chant, a sacred call to soothe the dying or stir the divine. Those first notes weren't just entertainment, they were memories turned into sound. Early music had purpose. Clapping or drum beats synced group work, boosted morale, or scared enemies. Repetition made it sticky. Before writing existed, info was sung, not spoken. Tunes helped memory, linking knowledge with melody and patterns. Oral tradition and music began hand in hand. In tribal rituals of ancient cultures, we find percussion instruments, wooden sticks, seed shakers, animal skins stretched tight for rhythms. These tools bonded communities, creating shared experiences without words. You didn't have to speak the same language to jam together. Music grew with spiritual beliefs. In ancient graves, instruments like flutes, drums, and bells were buried with the dead as if the afterlife had its own soundtrack. Or maybe music was for the living, echoing sadness, hope, or the urge to touch the unseen veil in those earliest sounds. We weren't just surviving, we began expressing, remembering, celebrating, and mourning before cities or legends. We sang in Mesopotamia's Fertile Crescent, where the Tigris and Euphrates weave through desert and clay. Music wasn't a game, it was essential. From Sumer to Babylon, from temples to taverns, sound shaped identity, order, and the divine. Mesopotamians didn't just play music, they recorded, structured, and tied it to heaven and earth. Some of the earliest visual records of music culture come from Sumerian cylinder seals and reliefs dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE. These tiny artworks show musicians with lyres, flutes, and drums. But the real magic later archaeological finds elaborately decorated lyres with gold, lapis lazuli, and carved bull heads. These weren't just tools, they were sacred objects buried with nobility, companions for souls on the journey beyond. The Mesopotamian lyre was sophisticated and resonant. Strings stretched over a wooden frame, plucked with fingers or bone picks. Musicians were pros, some trained in temples, others appointed by the court. Music marked rituals, coronations, parties, and battles. Every occasion had its own soundtrack, and then came the real breakthrough musical notation. A clay tablet from Ugarit, around 1400 BCE, is one of the oldest surviving examples of written music. It holds a hymn with not just words, but pitch instructions using a relative scale system. We don't know exactly how it sounded to ancient ears, but its existence shows how central music was to structure and spirituality. Music also linked to cosmology, important numbers, key intervals. Mesopotamian thinkers, like those in Babylon, believed music mirrored cosmic order, harmonizing like planets orbiting and seasons turning on time. This idea trickled into Greek philosophy centuries later, whether nuns sang for Inanna or wandering musicians played busy markets. Mesopotamian music was layered, professional, sacred, festive, political. It bridged mortals and gods in a world made of mud and mystery. Music shaped the invisible, tied memory to ritual, order to time, and soul to its story. In ancient Egypt, where gods wore animal heads and pharaohs were divine, music flowed like the Nile constant, sacred and life-giving. It echoed through temple courts, spilled into market stalls, and followed people from birth to burial. Egyptian music wasn't just decoration, it was vital. Egyptians believed music had magic. It could soothe gods, heal the sick, and guide the dead soul. Instruments were gifts from the gods, but most famously. The goddess Hathor often held a sistrum, a rattle like a sacred baby's toy. Shaking the sistrum meant waking life itself, that jangling sound, symbolizing the cosmic rhythm of creation. Archaeologists found harps, flutes, lutes, and lyres painted in Old Kingdom tomb murals from around 2500 BC. These weren't your average garage band instruments. They were finely crafted and decked out with fancy decorations. Harps could be angular or curved, usually played sitting on the ground. Their strings, made from animal guts because, of course, rang out during both religious ceremonies and royal parties. Music was basically the soundtrack of Egyptian rituals. Dawn choruses welcomed the gods at temples, and priests and priestesses weren't just mumbling prayers, they were trained musicians. Certain tunes were believed to vibe directly with gods or specific emotions. There was music for mourning, music for praising, music for cleansing your soul. Every action had its own soundtrack, but music wasn't just a rich person thing. Street musicians, dancers, and folk singers flooded the markets of Memphis and Thebes. Percussion instruments like frame drums, rattles, and castanets kept the community festivals bumping. Women often led performances, whether as pro artists or hired mourners crying at funerals. Egyptian hieroglyphs even gave us words to describe musical moods. Hes meant joy or worship, Tu meant sadness or mourning. Music wasn't just abstract art, it was the emotional foundation, and when death came knocking, music followed along. Funeral texts sometimes included instructions for chants and instruments in the afterlife, just like on Earth. The journey was never silent. Egyptian music served many misters gods, kings, farmers, and grieving families. But it always carried a deep truth that sound is the soul's language, and through that, even silence speaks volumes. In ancient Greece, music wasn't just art, it was math, medicine, philosophy, and fortune telling all rolled into one. Not just for fun, music was studied, theorized, and worshipped to the Greeks. Music was a mirror of the cosmos, harmonious, orderly, and deeply sacred. The Greek word mouse didn't just mean music, it covered the whole realm of the muses, those divine ladies inspiring poetry, dance, and song. Getting into music meant tapping straight into divine influence. So from street performers in Athens to philosophers in Ionia, music was both a daily habit and a metaphysical quest. Instruments were everywhere. The lyre, a string instrument tied to Apollo, was the star of education. Greek boys, especially from noble families, learned to play it as part of their official schooling. The kithara, a bigger, flashier lyre, was used in pro gigs and religious festivals. Then there was the aulos, a double-piped reed instrument with a sharp, piercing sound, often backing drama, rituals, and even military drills. Music was tightly woven into the art of theater in Greek tragedy. The chorus didn't just chant, they sang the script. The whole play was built on rhythmic lyrics, turning dialogue into a soundtrack that shaped fate. Every step Oedipus took, every cry Medea made, came with its own beat and melody. But behind the drama was theory, Pythagoras. The triangle dude himself was one of the first to suggest music could be understood through numbers. He found harmonious notes came from simple ratios like 2, 1, or 3, 2. From that came the idea of the music of the sphere's planets spinning in cosmic harmony, creating a perfect tune so flawless the human ear couldn't hear it. Plato and Aristotle expanded on this. Plato believed music shaped the soul and thus influenced the state. The moral health of society was measured by music. Some scales and modes uplifted spirits, others were downright dangerous. Music wasn't just expression, it was formation. In Greece, plucking a string was touching reality's blueprint. Singing was joining the divine order, and understanding music was the start of understanding the soul. When Rome absorbed other cultures, planets spinning in cosmic harmony, creating a perfect music so delicate human ears can't catch it. Plato and Aristotle took this idea further. Plato believed music shaped the soul, and thus the state, so society's moral health could be judged by its music. Some keys and rhythms lifted spirits, others were downright dangerous. Music wasn't just expression, it was formation. In Greece, plucking a string was touching reality's structure. Singing was joining divine order. Understanding music meant starting to understand the soul. When Rome absorbed cultures, planets also moved in cosmic harmony, making perfect music beyond human hearing. Plato and Aristotle expanded on this. Plato thought music formed the soul, and thus the nation. Society's moral health could be measured by music. Some scales and tunes uplifted the spirit, others were risky business. Music wasn't just expression, it was formation. In Greece, playing a string meant touching the fabric of reality. Singing meant joining the divine order, and understanding music meant beginning to understand the soul. When Rome adopted cultures around them, they didn't just grab land, they inherited music too, from Etruscan horns to Greek lyres. Roman music was basically a patchwork quilt of styles and traditions stitched together under one empire. But unlike the Greeks, who loved to philosophize about music's moral superpowers, the Romans cared more about practical uses and sometimes just making a lot of noise. Music was everywhere in Rome temples, army camps, theaters, parties, and those infamous arenas. It was used to give orders, entertain, and show off. One of Rome's iconic instruments was the cornu, a big curved bronze horn used in the military. When they blew it, it sent clear signals on the battlefield: orders, formations, warnings. Not pretty, but super effective. For Roman soldiers, music was survival. In everyday life, the soundscape got way richer. The tibia, Rome's take on the Greek aulos, was played at sacrifices and public events. Then there was the hydraulis, or water organ, an early keyboard instrument that used air and water pressure to make noise. It showed up in religious ceremonies, and gladiator fights, definitely loud, dramatic, and totally extra. Just right for Rome's flair for the theatrical, at private parties and fancy dinners. Music was more about seduction. Women and slave musicians often played stringed instruments like the cithara and lute, while dancers swayed softly to the beat. Among wealthy Romans, music was a status symbol, a fancy art imported from Greece or Egypt to impress guests and flaunt sophistication. But music also had spiritual roots in Roman religion. Some rituals required chants and a musical form called carmina. These were sacred spells believed to influence the gods or scare off bad vibes. Over time, some of those transformed into more structured hymns, mixing prayers with melodies. The Romans weren't exactly the most original composers, but boy, could they adapt. They absorbed music, so like they absorbed gods, rebranding, twisting, and recycling it to suit their needs. And as Roman roads marched armies across Europe, they brought songs, instruments, and musical customs along for the ride. Local tribes didn't just meet soldiers, they met the empire's soundtrack. In Rome, music served many masters glory, control, pleasure, and faith. It was the empire's heartbeat, echoing through marble halls and blood-soaked dust, long before the Vedic chants echoed through Indian temples. A quiet, yet profound musical culture was thriving in the Indus Valley, one of the world's earliest urban societies. Even though most of their instruments remain a mystery, the fragments we've found whisper of a people deeply in tune with rhythm, ritual, and sound. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Indus Valley left no texts to decode their music, but what they did leave behind musical tools, clay figurines, and urban sounds say a lot. Archaeologists unearthed cylindrical drums, conch shell trumpets, and flutes carved from bird bones and clay. Some flutes have finger holes spaced so perfectly it's clear they understood pitch and scales. The coolest find dancer figurines from sites like Mohenjo-Daro, frozen mid-step. Braided hair swinging, bodies swaying. Where there's dance, there's rhythm, and where there's rhythm, there's music. These statues hint not just at communal celebrations, but at choreographed drum performances. Culture-wise, drums weren't just for fun, they were a form of expression. Later, when Vedic civilization rose and Sanskrit texts took shape, Indian subcontinent's musical traditions became more complex than ever. But the seeds, the silent ceramic flutes of ancient India, had already taken root long ago, over time. Music in India became inseparable from spiritual practice. The Vedas, sacred Hindu texts, were chanted in strict melodic patterns called sama. This wasn't singing as you'd think. These were sound formulas meant to maintain cosmic order. By the time Natya, Shastra, an ancient treatise on drama, dance, and music written around 200 BCE, showed up, Indian music was sorted into ragas melodic modes and talas rhythmic cycles. Instruments like the veena, an early stringed instrument, and the mridangam, a double-headed drum, became must-haves for religious and court music. But despite all the theory, Indian music's soul stayed the same. Music is devotion, vibration, a bridge between body and spirit, sound and silence, mortal and divine. In the Indus land, music wasn't written with ink. It was written with breath, heartbeat, and eternity. In ancient China, music wasn't just noise. It was the audible cosmic order, rooted in Confucian and Taoist philosophy. Ancient Chinese music aimed to reflect harmony between heaven, earth, and humans. Playing music wasn't just for fun, it was about syncing up with the moral and natural rhythms of the universe. Some of the oldest archaeological finds include stone chimes called bianking and bone flutes from the Neolithic era. These instruments were carefully tuned not just to sound nice, but to embody cosmic principles. Every note linked to one of the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, as well as seasons and directions. Melodies weren't just music, they were philosophy and sound combined. By the Zhou dynasty, 1046-256 BCE, music had become a pillar of governance. Confucius famously said, "To educate a person, start with poetry, reinforce with rites, and complete with music." He believed music shaped the soul, and a well-run nation showed itself in its music. Harsh or chaotic tunes meant disorder. Gentle, orderly melodies symbolized harmony. Court musicians played instruments like the guqin, a 7-string zither linked to scholars and sages. It's quiet. Thoughtful tones weren't for crowds, but to nurture inner virtue. Players sat alone, fingers gliding over strings in a meditative chat between self and nature. Bigger orchestras used instruments like the sheng, a kind of free red pipe, plus drums and bronze bells, especially in ancestor and state ceremonies. Yayue, or elegant music, was the official soundtrack for honoring heaven and ancestors. Every sound, every interval had a ritual job, tightly controlled to avoid spiritual chaos. Chinese music theory also cooked up unique scales like the pentatonic, which uses 5 notes per octave. This gave Chinese melodies that smooth, flowing vibe, like water, wind, and deep thinking. Back in ancient China, listening to music was like tuning into the universe's balance, playing music well that was basically living well. Every note was a prayer, every silence, a lesson in ancient Jewish tradition. Music was the bridge between heaven and earth, sorrow and praise, humans and their covenant with God. It wasn't just entertainment, it was sacred. Every note played, every voice lifted was an offering. Right from the oldest books of the Hebrew Bible, music showed up as a core power. In Genesis, Jubal is dubbed the father of all harp and flute players, proving music was humanity's OG gift. In Exodus, after the Red Sea parted and the Israelites escaped Egypt, Miriam grabbed a tambourine and led the women in dancing and singing a celebration forever etched in sacred memory by King David's time. Music had become a structured, essential part of spiritual life. David himself was both warrior and musician, said to soothe King Saul's tormented soul with his harp. Under David's reign, music blossomed in temple rituals. He appointed Levite musicians, not just to perform, but to preserve sacred songs and maintain spiritual order through sound. The Psalms, many credit to David, became one of history's oldest and richest hymn collections. These poetic prayers were meant to be sung, chanted, or recited with instruments, usually harps, lyres, cymbals, and trumpets. Some psalms mourned, others celebrated victories, but all were heartfelt conversations with the divine. Solomon's first temple systematized music even more. Musicians took shifts, instruments were standardized, trumpets signaled offerings, cymbals marked sacred transitions, music structured the calendar, filled festivals, and deepened every ritual's meaning. Even after the temple's destruction, music survived in memory and exile. In Babylon, exiled Jews sang of Zion with trembling voices by the rivers of Babylon. We sat and wept. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? But they sang anyway. Jewish music didn't survive by echoing in stone halls, but by engraving itself on hearts. It's music of resilience, born from covenant and passed down through breath, flesh, and prayer. As the ancient world gave way to classical and medieval times, the music of early civilizations didn't vanish. It evolved. Instruments changed, scales adjusted, traditions folded into newer religious, philosophical, and cultural systems, but its spirit stuck around, the echo of Mesopotamian lyres, sparkling Egyptian cymbals, the pauses between Chinese guqin notes. Those sounds never died. They migrated, carried through time in the hands and hearts of those who remembered. In many ways, ancient music is a language we forgot how to fully speak, but never stopped listening to. We can't hear exactly how Babylonian hymns once sounded. We can only piece them together from clay tablets, scattered symbols, and ancient descriptions, but we can feel the intention. The effort to connect body and soul, time and eternity, even without full sheet music. We see music carved in stone and painted on walls, Minoan priestesses dancing in frescoes, Assyrian harp players on reliefs, Roman mosaics showing sitar players at banquets. Those images are still, but they pulse with rhythm. They remind us ancient music was never just background noise. It was the heartbeat of rituals, the breath of ceremonies, a spark of rebellion, and a balm for pain. Amazingly, some of it still lives on in India. The raga system follows rules born from ancient Vedic chants. In China, Guqin players still perform melodies from Confucius Temple. In Jewish synagogues, psalms are still chanted to melodies echoing thousands of years. This isn't a remake, it's continuity. Ancient music wasn't recorded on vinyl or streamed online. It was preserved through practice, people, and purpose, passed down not by wires, but by witnessing. We may never hear the full Inca festival song or royal hymn, but when a hand drums, a voice suddenly rises, or a melody lingers long enough to bring tears that's ancient music. Civilizations may have crumbled, but empires might have fallen, but their music still plays on, not in history books, but inside us.